assignment to chase desert predators with night vision, coyotes in particular, because the publication wanted images of how they move when heat is down and traffic thins. The plan was 3 nights out. I slept in the Jeep with the seats down and worked out of a pop-up ground blind I set 20 yards off a 2-track that died in a dry arroyo. It was a good pinch point. Mouse tracks scribbled in the sand, quail dust baths, scat with mesquite beans and hair. I bait nothing. I sit where prey and water make predators logical. The first afternoon, I drove the miles of washboard until the cell bars fell away and the chatter of the interstate faded. I chose a slightly raised bench for camp to keep flash floods out of the picture, tuned my satellite messenger to send a check-in once at dusk and once at dawn, and started walking sign. Coyotes were around. You can tell from the way a line of pads moves straight through gravel, from the scat on a rock, they like to post their roots, and from the night music if you get lucky. I found something else too, a big dog print with a long center pad, wide splay, almost too clean. It wasn't unusual enough to bother me. Out here you get feral dogs, ranch dogs, hybrids. The desert makes opportunists. I set the blind in the shadow of a palo verde and broke a small circle of stones for my stove. Gear went where it always goes, tripod legs splayed and balanced low, gimbal head leveled, Sony camera body, with the 200 to 600 mm zoom lens mounted and a 1.4 times teleconverter attached. Backup camera body with a 70 to 200 mm lens, in case something came inside my circle. I strapped a pair of passive infrared floodlights to the Palo Verde and another steel post, set to 850 nanometers so the glow is invisible to human eyes, and about as subtle as you can be without going full thermal. I tested autofocus against a foam block at 80 yards. I checked the zippered door of the blind twice. I locked the Jeep. I always lock the Jeep. You do it until it's muscle memory. People aren't the only clever ones. As twilight went purple over the Castle Dome Mountains, a single coyote barked way out in the flats. A dry yip answered north. It felt like the right choice of spot. I boiled water, ate a pouch meal that tasted like warm salt, and went to work. Coyotes are confident. They watch you break your silhouette and they clock everything. You'll see it in their head angle and in the way their edges never fully relax. That first night, around 10, one drifted into the infrared, a big male by the carriage and the neck. He moved like he'd inherited the place. Tail level, feet stepping in line to save energy, nose pulling air with intent. I watched him lope parallel to the wash. I took a few frames when he cut across the pinch point. He heard my shudder even with the silent mode and stopped. Head up, ears like points. A small drop of saliva stretched from his lip and snapped when he closed his mouth. He looked past the blind at the Jeep, and then back to where I was. It wasn't the usual look of, I hear something. It was inventory. Where's the human? Where's the box that smells like him? Where's the heat? Where's the hard shelter? He circled once, never crossing my wind, and faded. I wrote it off as a dominant male patrolling his groove and felt mildly proud of where I'd chosen to sit. Around midnight I heard soft steps in the gravel around the Jeep. I kept still and watched through the lens and waited for a head to swing into the infrared. It never did. Whatever made the steps paced the far side and left. Morning was windless and mean with sun. I walked the wash edge and found pads, plenty of them. One track line stopped at the Jeep's back corner, came tight to the passenger door, then moved on. Some scratches scuffed the dust near the handle. That was a first. I wrote a note in my field book and used a baby wipe to clean my own oily prints off the door metal, so I'd see anything new the next day. I checked the blind stakes and let them bite deeper. Then I napped to buy hours for later, because the second night is always better than the first. Your smell settles. Your camp becomes a fact. The second evening was colder. I added a fleece and a beanie and a chemical hand warmer in my right pocket to keep dexterity. I topped off my batteries. I set a second camera on a low tripod aimed at the Jeep doors. Manual focus at 6 feet. Aperture opened as wide as it would go. Fast shutter speed, interval timer running, because some part of me wanted to know what had paced there. I set a boot with a pebble balanced on the tailgate as an improvised alarm. If anything jostled it, it would crash and I'd hear it. The wind went steady from the west around 9. Coyotes started their gossip chorus 3 ridges over around 9:30. I could tell there were at least 3. Around 10:30 the big one came again. He worked the same line, bolder this time. Less pausing, less smelling. He cut the pinch and then circled and did a strange thing. He stopped dead at the exact angle where the infrared floodlights would have been in a human's peripheral. He looked through my setup, not at my lens, but at the blackness where glass was inside the blind. It's hard to explain. There's a difference between an animal keying on motion and keying on intention. This felt like the second. I didn't shoot. His eyes glowed ghost white in the infrared, and the sensor will sometimes catch that wash and blow the whole exposure. I held. He broke off and moved toward the Jeep. My second camera's interval timer clacked a few times. He stopped and flicked an ear at that, then eased to the passenger door again. He lifted onto the rock slider with a front paw, stretched tall, and pressed at the handle with his muzzle. Not pawing, not scratching, a press and a pull, like he'd seen the cause and effect. It didn't move because I lock my doors, always. He dropped and stepped back, and then he did the thing that wrecked my sense of category. He stood up again, this time pushing fully onto his hind legs, balancing like a man does when he reaches for something on a counter. He leaned, and one front paw hooked the handle, and I heard the very clear, very human sound of a door latch reluctant against the lock's resistance. A click. Not the big clunk you get when the door opens, just the click of a handle trying to actuate a locked mechanism. I didn't breathe. He dropped to 4 legs, tilted his head, and turned, slowly, like a thought passing across a mind. In infrared, eyes go bright and dead at the same time. He looked straight at the blind, straight through the bush, across 100 yards of dark. I know he can't see infrared, but he looked like he could see me. For a long minute nothing moved. The desert held its breath. I felt my heartbeat in my ears and forced it down. I thought through steps. Horn, headlights, make it loud and surprising, get in the Jeep, leave. But leaving at night on a 2-track is how you catch a washout wrong and bury to the frame. He dropped his gaze first. He patted around the back of the Jeep. The boot with the pebble teetered but didn't fall. I didn't like that he knew exactly where to place weight. From then on, I didn't doze. I watched. He didn't come back into the infrared illumination for almost an hour. When he did, it was at the edge of the cone, further than before, making lazy S patterns, nose up and then down, like he was searching for my boundaries. Once, he broke to the far side of the wash and disappeared for 20 minutes. When he came back, he came low and quick and stopped behind the blind at the only corner where I hadn't trimmed a line of creosote branches. I heard his feet through the fabric. I smelled him. Rank, hot, wild meat and mesquite blossoms. The blind's back panel pushed inward just slightly, convex to concave, like a chest exhaling. Then it stopped. The zipper tab on the door rustled. He was touching it. A claw or a tooth touched the metal. It tapped. It didn't pull. I eased the air horn out of my side pocket and gave it a short, flat blast. The panel popped back. The sound went hard into the night and died like it does in open country. He didn't run. He took 3 steps away and sat down. I could hear the weight settle on his hips. I could imagine the head tilt. We did that for 5 full minutes, me facing a zipper, him sitting in blackness 3 feet behind cloth. When he left, he went toward the Jeep again. The interval timer went tick, tick, tick. Then, finally, the boot fell, a hollow thunk and a rattle of rubber on metal. He startled right then. He didn't like the chaotic sound. He pulled back and paced. Then he slid off into the wash and vanished. No coyotes answered his going. The night stayed weirdly silent after that. Just before dawn, the temperature hit its bottom, and the sky got its first of 3 shades of gray. I broke the blind and stowed the glass because I didn't want to give myself a reason to stay longer than I had to. I walked to the Jeep with my head on a swivel. There were prints. A lot of them. In the cold sand you get edges like poured concrete. The coyote's hind pads showed crescent moons where claws hadn't dug. The front pads were wrong in a way I couldn't quantify at first. I crouched and made myself be slow, 5 toe marks instead of 4? No, 4, but long and even. The metacarpal pad, the big heart shape, looked stretched, like it had been pressed by weight set too far back. On one track, the drag from the 5th toe was a faint line above the other 4, as if a dew claw had dragged from a higher angle. I've seen that on dogs. I've never seen it paired with the hind leg stance I watched through glass a few hours earlier. The passenger door had new scratches that weren't just surface dust swirls. I could rake fingernails deep across paint and only get chalk. These were through the oxidized layer. Not key deep, but not something I could wipe away. They clustered at the handle. 3 verticals, 1 diagonal. I looked through the second camera's frames right there, and then again later in the Jeep when I had coffee moving through me, and my hands didn't shake. Nothing crisp. Motion blur. No big reveals or monster faces or bodies in mid-stand. One sequence at 2:13 in the morning showed a slope of fur across the edge of frame, and the suggestion of a long limb where the joint pinched light. The last frame before the interval timer shut down from battery save was just the Jeep's paint ghosting the infrared. In it, the handle was centered, and something that could have been a paw, or a hand, or the business end of a muzzle was at the edge of the handle. The shape of it wasn't right for a paw. It looked too narrow before it broadened. There was the hint of a crease that did not belong to a pad. I should have left after that. The job had deliverables in the can. A coyote patrolling, a portrait with eyes like white coins, a set of tracks with crosslight. Instead, I told myself that daylight would clean the weird off and that I was being dramatic, and that I could shift the blind and get a safer angle and a longer lens and work one more sunset. I moved the blind 50 yards farther from the Jeep, into a triangle of brittlebush where the wash narrowed and the Palo Verde's shadow pooled earlier. I changed the Jeep's orientation, so the driver's door faced the blind with no obstructions between. I added a shop-bought magnetic read alarm to the passenger door, one of those cheap units you stick to a window frame that screams if the sensor separates, and wrapped a strip of gaffer's tape around the door handle's seam so I'd see if it shifted. I wedged a pair of small cowbells under the rocker panel and tied them to a length of light line that tensioned just enough so a tug on the handle would ring them. None of that would stop anything. It would give me seconds. Seconds are everything. Then I drove 8 miles back to a pullout where I got 1 bar of signal if I stood on the bumper. I sent a larger check-in than usual to a friend who knows my stupid habits, and I told him, plainly, that something about this coyote was wrong. Too confident, too curious, too handsy with the Jeep. He texted back that hybrids and ferals are a thing, and to watch for mange, and to not be a hero. He asked if I was armed. I told him yes, that was true. I keep a revolver in a lockbox and bear spray on a mole strap inside the blind. The gun's for 2-legged problems and feral packs. The spray is because I'd rather not shoot anything I don't have to. He told me to send him a pin, to check in at midnight, and to leave if anything felt off. I told him I would, then drove back to my arroyo with the usual guilt that I was making a story where there wasn't one. The third evening started quietly, and stayed that way long enough that I believed I'd scared the animal off with human nonsense. I watched a tarantula cross the wash like a walking hairbrush. I filmed a kangaroo rat kick sand over its burrow. A great horned owl drifted once across my infrared cone and kept going like a ship through fog. The air smelled like creosote and dust. The north wind came light and clean around 9. At 10:20 the read alarm chirped once and then screamed. The cowbells rang a bright silly peal. I flinched hard enough to bump the lens into the blind sleeve. I fumbled the key fob in my pocket and thumbed the panic button. The Jeep's horn went full blast, lights strobing, hazards pulsing. The alarm rolled across the arroyo and up the cholla-spiked hillside and then hung there like a held breath. The read alarm cut out when the handle went back to rest, then chirped again, then screamed again. He was testing it, pulling and releasing, pulling and releasing. I didn't hit the panic button a second time. I let the Jeep do its whole cycle and die and reset. In the wash of the infrared light, a form backed off 3 steps and stood. Tall, not a 4-legged stance. Tall, like a person taking shock, recalibrating. It held like that for a count of 2 and then it moved sideways, a shuffle with hips working wrong for an animal, like knees bending where no knee should be. It sank to all fours and disappeared under the door line. My heart put its hands around my throat and squeezed. I put the revolver on the blind floor by my right boot and the bear spray on top of the blind bag. I told myself 3 rules out loud in a whisper, because whispering makes them feel carved in stone. Don't shoot unless something is in the blind. Don't run unless you are running to the Jeep and driving. Don't leave it to chance. I switched my camera to video and pressed record on the main camera body. The infrared floodlights hummed. The desert held its breath again. Or maybe that was me. Nothing happened for a strange amount of time. 10 minutes is forever when alarms just screamed and a thing you watch stand like a man is somewhere between you and your only hard shelter. And then something happened to the blind. It moved. Not in the wind. Not the little breathing you get when fabric expands and contracts with temperature. It moved the way a tent moves when someone pushes it with a flat palm. One slow press at the back panel. It went in 1 inch, then 2, then more, when weight kept coming. A paw, or a hand, spread behind the fabric and pressed. I could see the silhouette in infrared like a shadow puppet made of ruined anatomy. 4 long digits and a heavier heel where the pad should be. The hand slid sideways until it found the line of the zipper again. The metal tab made that tiny tapping sound as something toyed with it. Subjects learn off motion and reward. It had learned that pulling can be reward. I spoke in the same voice I use with animals that get too close to a lens. No, not a yell, not scared. Firm, human, present. The hand stopped. It held there, palm to fabric, like a blind high five from something that did not know games. Then it slid down and away, and the pressure left the wall, and the blind breathed back to its proper shape. The read alarm knocked again. The Jeep's handle creaked. The cowbells rang once, twice, then quiet. I pictured the animal, if it was an animal, standing with its chest against the door seam, learning how much pull to put on a handle before the read alarm complains and when the complaint stops, testing the tolerance until it could get a full pull without a scream. Learning. I had to move. Fighting the instinct to freeze is the hardest part of work like this. Freezing feels safe, and it kills you slow. I slid the zipper up 2 inches, pushed the lens into the gap, and lined the Jeep in the screen. The infrared floodlights gave me range. The handle was right in the middle of the frame. The head of the coyote, or the something, rose into the cone like a tide coming up a dune. For a second it looked perfectly normal. Pointed muzzle, ears, the ridge of a shoulder. Then that muzzle stretched too far forward and angled sideways, and the ear that should have been in frame was wrong by 1 inch. It wasn't where ears live. I don't know how else to say it. You learn where things go by looking through glass for 20 years, and that ear had slid. The front limb came up. The paw didn't paw. It rolled like a wrist. 4 digits came down on the handle and pulled. The read alarm let out a half chirp and cut off as the magnets separated just slow enough to fool the sensor. The handle came to its stop at the lock. The lock held. The digits flexed. The handle fluttered against the lock like a trapped bird. The thing's head turned, and the bright, dead eyes in the infrared looked across 100 yards and found the sliver of glass where mine were and held them like a pin through a bug. I hit the panic button. The horn and lights went berserk. The thing didn't jerk away this time. It released the handle and took a smooth, almost bored step backward and stood up straight into full biped, tall enough that the top of its skull just touched the bottom of the side window. It put its right hand, paw, whatever, flat to the glass and it pushed, and there on my screen I watched 5 splayed digits press and fan against a Jeep window I had wiped clean that morning. Not a paw print, not a hand print, something between, the heel of it wrong, the length of 2 of the fingers even longer, the claws, call them that, black and not curved enough to feel like claws should be. For a 1/10 of a second I thought I wanted that print. The part of my brain that thinks in deliverables and cover shots and special licenses wanted it like a kid wants a rare card. Then the thing leaned its face to the glass and breathed a fog bloom that no coyote makes on a cold pane because coyotes pant and huff. They don't lay breath in a long, steady fog. The fog started 1 inch above where a coyote's mouth would be. I dropped the camera and stood up into the roof of the blind. I fumbled for the bear spray, pulled the safety, and with my other hand I shoved the zipper up full and crashed through the doorway with the horn howling and the infrared highlights white hot and the spray can held out like a blunt weapon. I shouted at it. I don't remember the word. It was probably the same no. It was probably my name. It doesn't matter. The thing left the window and took 3 steps sideways, and in those 3 steps, it moved like a man on a grade with his ankles bound, knees bending wrong, hips making the effort up for what the ankles couldn't do. Then it pitched down to all 4s in a way that made the back bend in 2 places instead of 1, and it ran, and that part was all coyote. Fast, low, easy over rock, gone. I went to the Jeep. I unlocked the door and got in and locked it again, and I did not look in the back seat, because if something was there, the next parts of my life would just go differently forever. I turned the key. The engine caught. The horn cut off when I canceled the panic. The infrared floodlights still hummed out behind the blind. I put the Jeep in drive and rolled forward onto the 2-track, and made the kind of 3-point turn you do when your hands know your vehicle better than your head knows fear. I drove out with all my lights on. The rocks caught on skid plates, and the antenna whistled, and the coffee mug I hadn't stowed clacked on plastic. I didn't look in the mirrors until I was 2 miles from camp, and when I did, I didn't see anything but dust. I slept 3 hours at the paved road pullout with the seat reclined, and the revolver and the spray on my chest under a jacket, and the dawn crowd of snowbirds clattering by in recreational vehicles. Then I drove to a ranger station. I didn't walk in with words like standing or hand. I walked in with truth that could be categorized. I said I had a coyote too bold around my vehicle. I said it was testing door handles. I said it might be feral or habituated. I asked if anyone had reported aggressive animals in that drainage. The ranger was steady and tired in the way of people who hear a lot of heat and noise for a living. He asked for my GPS pin. He asked if there was food in the car. I told the truth. Jerky, peanuts, a cooler with cold packs, nothing scented left open. He told me about a nuisance report 2 months earlier near Palm Canyon Road where a coyote had taken a day pack off a chair. He told me about feral dogs. He told me about coy dogs that learn weird tricks when they live too much on the edge of human trash. He asked me to fill out a note. He wrote one of his own. "Do you have pictures?" he asked. I gave him what I had. The portrait, the patrol, the blurred handful of Jeep frames. He studied the long limb in one frame and didn't say anything. He looked at the scratches on my passenger door and traced one and didn't say anything. Then he asked if I could take him out to the site. I said yes. I didn't want to go back alone, and some part of me wanted someone else to stand where it had stood so I could be sure I wasn't telling myself a story. We drove in his truck. He had a rifle in a rack and a can of pepper spray on his belt. He was quiet in a professional way. When we pulled into my spot, he stayed in the cab long enough to listen, then stepped out slow and took his time like a man reading a page in a language he knows. He found the prints because anyone would have. They were everywhere I had seen them and fresh over my own tracks leaving in the dark. He crouched like I had. He measured one with a metal rule. He stared at the way the dew claw line dragged above the 4. "Dog," he said, but not like he believed it fully. "Or mix." He pointed at the blind's corner where the sand showed a slide mark that could have been a hand pressing. He didn't comment. He walked to the passenger door and looked at the gaffer tape seam I'd set over the handle. The tape was peeled at the edge in a clean little curl, like someone had worked a fingernail under it and tested. He pointed at that and nodded. "These things are problem solvers," he said. "If it's a dog mixed in, you get even more weird. They'll open coolers. They'll figure out those Yeti latches if they watch you." We didn't stay long. He didn't ask me to. The sky was brutally blue and the black months-old crust line from the last rain brushed off under our boots. He told me there was a rescue the previous winter for a hiker who got turned around at night and started following a set of dog tracks, thinking it would lead to a road. It led nowhere. The tracks looped. It was likely coyotes circling quail. But sometimes the way these animals move mimics purpose that isn't there. In town that afternoon, when my hands were steady, I sat in the shade of a fuel station and scrubbed the outside of the passenger window with a white rag and watched for oil or prints. There was nothing you could sell as evidence, nothing photographable. If there ever was a fog of breath on that glass, it had burned off between the panic and the drive and the dawn. At home, I went through the memory card again with a bigger monitor and better software. Same result, hints and blur. The still that got me the most wasn't even the weird hand. It was a single frame where the head was against the glass and the ear was wrong. The angle was off by that 1 inch my mind couldn't let go. An inch isn't much on a monitor. It's a lot on a skull. I turned in my deliverables. Coyote moving through infrared cones. Decent composition. A good sharp eye. Some sense of place. The editor emailed, "Nice work." A week later, a copy desk sent a follow-up about coyotes and car doors because someone had linked a video from a city park of a raccoon opening a cooler. I wrote a sidebar on animal intelligence and object permanence, and learned helplessness, and how associative learning is just the desert with a notebook. It was clean. It made sense. I went to the gym. I slept with the hall light on for 2 nights. That should be where this ends. Me doing the reasonable human thing of explaining the unexplainable until it sits comfortably. That's what I'd prefer. I like categories. I like boxes with labels. There is a last piece, and it's the only part I can't wedge into the box without shaving off too much truth. I didn't include it in the report. I'm including it here because you don't know me and it won't cost me a professional relationship. 2 days after I got home, I detailed the Jeep. I pulled mats, shook dust, wiped plastics. When I peeled the gaffer tape residue off the passenger handle with my thumbnail, a small filament of something lifted free from the seam, a fine, pale hair, longer than coyote guard hair, thicker at the base than dog. It had a bend that looked like it had been pressed under adhesive for hours. I set it on the black plastic of the handle to photograph it. It was so light that even my breath would move it. I stepped back from my phone, and in that second, a breeze came through the carport, and the hair lifted and danced, and was gone. I stood there with my dumb phone out and a clean handle and no proof. I don't go out alone at night for work right now. I tell editors I'm on a daylight project or that I'm caught up and give the jobs to a friend who likes roads and crews and people. Maybe I'm soft for a while. Maybe I'm smart for a while. I don't know. I'll find out in November when the mule deer rut starts and the coyotes run wider. Here's what I do know, and it is enough of an ending for me. Whatever was out there learned from me. It watched me open a door, and it tried to repeat the motion. It tested the thing that screamed, and taught itself the amount of pull to stay quiet. It knew where I was in the blind. It touched the zipper. It pressed a palm, call it that, against the glass of a door I had locked because some instincts are older than cameras. It stood and looked back when I made a human world explode around it, and it did not break inside the noise. And then it left when I left, and it did not follow me onto pavement and into the light, where our rules hold harder. Sometimes survival is not heroic. Sometimes it's a series of boring choices, made early and kept. I locked the door. I had the alarm ready. I didn't try to get the perfect shot when something that didn't fit my labels pressed its shape against mine. I traded a story I wanted for a drive home I could make. That's all the hero I needed to be. A month later, the ranger emailed me a one-line update from his personal address. No new reports. I start it. I keep it. If that's closure, I'll take it. I know what I saw, and I know what I did not get, and I know I am still here to sit very still for other animals that do not want my doors. Late September in the Sawtooths feels like a house after the party has ended. The dust is settling, the air has a sharp edge, and almost everyone has gone home. That was the appeal. My friend Evan and I live a few hours away, and we'd both been shuffling work around to squeeze in one clean, simple overnighter before the weather turned for good. Iron Creek to Alpine Lake and back. A forecast that said, in so many words, you might see a dusting overnight. Enough to feel like early winter without getting stuck in it. We liked the math of that. We wanted the cold and the quiet without turning the trip into a rescue. The plan was straightforward. Drive to the Iron Creek trailhead near Stanley. Hike the 5-ish miles in with manageable elevation. Camp on durable ground out of the obvious wind lanes. Set a good bear hang. sleep behind solid nylon, boil coffee in the morning, and come down before the weekend crowd reappeared. We parked just before noon. The mountains above us were wearing that early fall color that isn't quite anything. Greens dulled down to a darker shade, the understory going the color of straw, a chip of blue sky above everything. The lot was mostly empty except for 2 dusty pickups and a rental SUV with a Denver plate. The kiosk had the usual notices: campfires restricted, trail work completed near the lake, a warning about leaving food in cars, a line about cow moose with calves being short-tempered in the fall. The self-issue permit box had a pencil on a string. I filled in our names and route, and slid the yellow copy behind the dash of my car while Evan tightened his pack straps and readjusted his trekking poles for the 100th time. It was quiet enough that we could hear Iron Creek from the parking lot. There wasn't any wind to push sound around. It made the whole place feel padded. We started up just after 12:30. The trail out of Iron Creek is honest about what it's going to do. It rolls, it climbs, it crosses water at good, sensible bridges, and it steadily corrals you into rock country. You pass into those stretches of forest where the older firs have furrows in their bark like they've been corded by hand. Every once in a while the view opens, and a spire of pale granite shows itself beyond the near trees. The grade never got rude, just consistent. We fell into a rhythm where we didn't talk unless there was something practical to say. We made steady time to the spur that climbs to Alpine Lake from the main trail that goes to Sawtooth Lake. There's a wooden sign with a routed arrow, and a name you can't mistake. We took a minute there to drink and check layers because the air cooled the second we turned off into that more sheltered draw. We saw one pair of hikers coming down as we went up the spur. They were late middle-aged, moving carefully, and carrying the kind of gear that says they've done this for years. Their faces were bright from cold and exercise. We pulled off to let them pass and traded the standard summit talk you hear on any mountain trail. "Any snow up there?" I asked. "Just frost in the shade," the woman said. "It's pretty, quiet too." They told us their car was the rental with Denver plates. We told them we'd be up for one night, just a quick turnaround. They said have fun, and we said the same as if fun is a thing you can guarantee. We reached Alpine Lake at about 4:15 by my watch. The lake sits in a rock bowl like someone set it there with a level. Alpine Peak pushes up beyond it, and there's a line of gray talus along the east shore like the mountain shrugged a shoulder and dropped those blocks with no pattern. The outlet stream ran clear and glassy, and there were old campsites on the durable flats back from the water, set discreetly behind low, scattered boulders. No one else was up there. A farther ridge carried a smear of cloud that looked harmless. We picked a spot with a natural windbreak and set the tent tight, corners staked and guy lines snug. I like habits in the backcountry. Footprint down, poles clipped, stakes seated, rainfly ready even if the sky says you might not need it. We filtered water, set a food hang in a stand of stout branches, and started dinner early so we could move into warm clothes without the awkward dance of cooking in the full dark. Evan took the stove and I built a quiet little living room out of rocks so we could sit without freezing. We ate watching the surface of the lake go flat as a skin, and then unflat again with the smallest breeze. The first thin film of ice formed around a shallow rock, and then broke free in a plate the size of a dinner tray. We called out small observations like that back and forth, because it was better than talking about anything else. Work, bills, whatever was stacked up waiting for us at home. After we cleaned up, we did a slow walk around camp with headlamps off, letting our eyes adjust, just to map in our brains where the rocks and roots were so we wouldn't stumble later. We turned in by 8:30. The temperature went from brisk to bone cold the second we climbed into our bags. The kind of dry cold that makes the inside of your nose feel like a cracked sink. I lay there listening to the tent fabric do that soft, occasional tick as it adjusted to the night. Somewhere down valley, a single elk bugled like a car with a failing belt. It was far enough away that the sound came without any weight. The sky through the vents was clean of cloud. I wasn't worried about the forecast anymore. If there was snow, it would be a powder of sugar. I told myself that as I let my body heat up the cold nylon around me and felt weightless for the first time in months. I could feel the lake under the sight like a slow idea. Everything was in its place. That's when the first runner went past. I call it a runner because that's the closest word I have for the way it moved. Not a walk, not a trot, not the skitter of a small animal startled and darting. This moved like a human running hard, cutting a straight, efficient line across open ground. Only it wasn't human. I'm skipping ahead by saying that, but I knew it even then before I had anything to support the knowing. It went by the windward side of our tent going north to south, and it was quick enough that the sound was a single run-on word, except for one detail that stuck and slowed time down a little. A dry clicking that came in a set of rapid, precise taps, like fingernails finding purchase on rock. You know the sound a dog's claws make on a kitchen floor when it takes a corner? Imagine that, but not cute and not on wood. And imagine that sound without any breath behind it. No panting, no effort, no mechanical noise of a body pushing air in and out. Just the clicks and the feeling of movement. I sat up so fast the quilt pulled my hat off. Evan's headlamp clicked on at the same moment as mine. The tent was instantly thrown into that weird fabric glow where every shadow is flattened and nothing is helpfully sharper. "Did you hear?" we both said, and then stopped because obviously we had. If something is imaginary, you don't both sit up at the same time and swear at the same fraction of a second. We didn't say anything else for a few breaths. I listened for the tail end of footfalls, for anything at all moving through brush, for the crack of a branch under weight. Nothing came. The only sound was the very faint hiss of the stove cooling 3 yards away. It didn't even hum like stoves sometimes do. The air felt like it had a lid on it. "Deer?" Evan said after a minute, working hard to sound casual. "That would have to be a deer on tiptoes," I said, "or a person sprinting without lungs." We laughed a little at our own joke because that's better than thinking. We stayed awake for an hour after that first pass. I told myself it was a coincidence of wind, and my brain stitching together a pattern of head noise. But nothing else moved. No voles in the duff, no nightbirds. Even when there's silence at altitude, there is still a catalog of small, healthy noises. Needles drifting, distant water, the far rasp of a beetle. This was quiet, like a power had been turned off. I kept checking my watch to see if time was behaving. 9:15, 9:30, 9:45. Right around 10, when I finally started to slide into that in-between place where you aren't asleep yet, but you're walking toward it, the runner went by again. This time it came from the opposite side and cut closer. The pattern was identical, the sense of a hard sprint with the restraint of a line runner, the dry, precise clicks, and the complete absence of breath. I would have taken anything. One pant, the snag of cloth, a throat clear, a foot sliding on loose dirt, a sharp inhale. The brain gets uneasy when the expected sound is missing. My headlamp was already in my hand. I took it slow instead of snapping it on. If it was a deer, the normal explanation, blasting a light would spook it into that blind crashing that gets animals hurt and people kicked. If it was a person, then I didn't want to become the person standing in a tent shining a light straight ahead while they stand at my blind spot. I counted to 20 with the lamp off, then brought it up under my chin like I was about to tell a ghost story and clicked it on. The beam cut the little vestibule and found the zipper and the shadow of my boots in a triangle of raw granite just beyond the fly. Evan turned his slowly, reaching a different wedge of outside. Nothing there. The only thing new was the way the cold felt like it had deepened by 10 degrees in 10 seconds, which I know is impossible from a weather standpoint. But that's not an exaggeration. My nose wanted to run just from the change. We unzipped and crawled out, taking the idiot risk of letting the warmth inside the bags drain off and blow into the night. I've done enough trips to know better. I did it anyway, because the idea of staying in the tent while something ran around it was worse. The ground was hard and loud under our knees. I put the beam on the open kitchen zone we'd cleared, and then widened it to the lake edge. Old snow patches from the past week's storm looked like the foam caught in the rocks of a creek. No fresh prints, not that you'd expect them to show in that frost and duff. We scanned the talus line. Nothing. We scanned the trail back toward the spur. The world grinned back at us with teeth of granite, and then grew featureless again when our headlamps found only empty distance. We talked in short, practical sentences. "You bring the spray out?" "Yep." "Where's your knife?" "Pocket." "Any food out?" No. We did a second sweep, behind the tent, at the latrine rock, under the hang. Nothing disturbed. We started to feel foolish standing there in base layers with the cold getting to our digits. The moment we turned our bodies back toward the tent, just that shift of orientation, the runner went past a third time. In daylight I would tell you it cut a new line, slightly uphill, parallel to the second pass, too smooth. In the dark I only registered that the click pattern came faster this time, like claws or nails or something finding the small rock edges and using them as a ladder. It moved like you move when you think you are about to be seen, committed, efficient, no wasted movement. It crossed the same patch of ground we had just scanned with our beams, and it never hit brush or picked up duff enough to broadcast its presence. I swung hard in that direction and caught the solid backs of larger boulders with dead air between them. "Okay," Evan said, the word clipped down. That was all either of us said. We climbed back inside the tent and zipped it like we were closing a locker door, and then we lay there on our backs with our hands laced over our chests, and we didn't sleep. Sleep is weird. Even when you're sure you didn't do it, you probably did, and the opposite is true too. I must have, an hour, two, because when the sky began to change from black to charcoal, I had that stale mouth feeling I get only after a nap. The subtle pool of gray around the tent footprint brightened, and outside things took form by degrees. First the nearest rocks, then the waist-high shrubs, then the boulder field. I have a ritual on cold mornings, where I force myself out first and get water going so the second person isn't tearing their warm cocoon without a promise of heat. I unzipped, slid out, and immediately forgot the stove. There's a particular kind of print that makes you stand still with your mouth open like you walked into a smell. I've seen mountain lion pads in fresh snow, clean circles with sharp lobe marks, elegant as drawings. I've seen elk tracks blown out and doubled after a storm walks them in. I've seen the sloppy ballerina of bare feet. This was none of those. It wasn't human either, not in the way human feet look when someone loses a boot and leaves a cartoon with 5 rounded toe prints and a heel. What cut the line through our sight had toes that were too long and too even, laid out like 5 siblings spaced almost the same distance from one another. The middle slightly longer, but not by much. The pinky not nearly as short as you'd expect. The heel mark wasn't a squared block, but a narrow taper like someone cut away everything extra from the back half of a foot and left only a blade. The line arced, smooth and confident, from just beyond the talus through open ground past the tent. It missed our guy lines by inches, and then continued behind the kitchen stones, passing within 2 feet of where we'd stored the stove. The depth of the prints confused me. They were pressed deep at the toe where you push off, then just the suggestion of weight under the ball, then almost nothing at the blade of the heel, like whoever made them carried itself forward without setting full mass down. The stride was long for a person, but within human range, 4 feet, give or take. The direction was even stranger, where you'd expect a wandering inquiry. Sniff here, turn there, stop at a food bag. The arc said, "I know what I'm doing, and I am not interested in you beyond collecting the lines you laid down with your bodies." I followed the prints with the same caution I'd use handling an unfamiliar tool. I didn't step inside them or cross them. I traced the arc to the point where the track line crossed itself near our tent door. And that's where I saw the second thing. Deer hair strung between 2 branches at head height, like someone had flossed the forest. Someone or something had taken what looked like a bundle of coarse guard hairs and drawn them between 2 saplings just wide enough apart to hold them under spring tension, then left the hair to snag and hang. It wasn't enough to be a snare, it wasn't a trap. It looked like, this is odd to say, a stringer from a fisherman, except made of hair. The hair was hollow when I bent one strand gently and looked at the cut end. Deer hair is like that. Tubular, good for insulation. It smelled faintly like an animal that lives outside. There was no meat or skin, just hair, and something had smoothed it down with fingers, or fingers equivalent, because the strands had that static lay to them like they had been combed. Evan came out behind me, saw my posture, and went quiet in the same way I had. He stepped around me without me saying a word, and looked at the prints in the hair, and then at our tent, and our food, hanging in the lake and back to me. 10 minutes, he said. I nodded. That wasn't a suggestion. We don't rush Camp Breakdown because that's how you leave stupid things behind, like gloves or a bag of trash. But we moved with a speed that felt like wading through cold syrup. Tent down, shaken clean, rolled, stuffed. Pads deflated and coiled, stove bagged, food off the hang line wound. Everything stowed in the same places we had it yesterday so our muscle memory could find it. We didn't talk about coffee. We didn't talk about oatmeal. We ate a strip of room temperature jerky and a handful of trail mix while standing and looking up and down the draw. I can tell you the exact number of minutes because I watched the second hand go once across my watch, and then again, and then 6 more times. We were moving at 7:30 and on the trail by 7:40. We descended into sleet. The forecast had promised a dusting, and the mountains delivered the kind that can't choose between forms and gives you all of them. Needles of ice that bounce off the brim of your hat, then flakes the size of moths that stick to your shoulders, then a fine sugar that slicks the rocks without announcing itself. The trail switched back down a rib, and then followed the creek in a drainage where the trees, tall and dark and straight, stood like pillars. Our plan was to move at a steady pace, no jogging, no stopping except to address necessities. We fell into a pattern of 45 minutes walking, and 2 minutes drinking and eating and looking and listening. We did not discuss the prints. We did not need to. Everything in our bodies had already filed that under "not for discussion" out here. Somewhere in the long middle of the descent, we both became aware of a new sound that was actually an old sound we hadn't noticed had been missing. The creek. It had been there all along, of course, the white noise of moving water. But once you're tuned to listen for footfalls and clicks and the micro sounds of a body moving, you can forget the base layer. When we tuned back into it, it was almost comforting. Then, right after that comfort started to take, the runner paralleled us. I did not see it head on. If I had, I would have a cleaner sentence to offer you here. What I have instead is the calculus of peripheral vision and sound. We were maybe 1.5 miles from the junction with the main trail, in a series of longer switchbacks cut across a slope with slope breaks of boulders. The sleet had gone back to needles that made a soft hiss. I could see my breath clearly when I exhaled. It came out and hung and then was gone. Evans did the same, visible in front of his shoulder as he walked. To our left was a broken field of rock dotted with low, tough shrubs. If you told me to place a bet on where a thing would move if it wanted to be quiet, I'd put my money on that exact terrain. Too open to be noisy brush, too broken to be a simple marching path. That's where the runner was. It moved level with us. When we turned the switchback, so did it, matching us 2 contours up. I won't repeat the click detail again except to say it came when it should, fast and exact, off rock. I won't labor the breath detail except to say that even in this cold, where your own breath is visible 3 feet out and the air is still enough to hold it for a count, nothing accompanied that movement. Nothing fogged, nothing exhaled. It stayed just long enough to make a point, 2 switchbacks, maybe 3. And then the sound cut off as if we had walked past the end of a narrow hallway and the door behind us shut. We didn't talk, we didn't stop. We adjusted small things automatically the way you do when you feel eyes on you. I shortened my pole length by a notch so I'd have more leverage for a quick plant if the trail got slick. Evan took his spray out and moved it from his hip to the shoulder strap so it would be faster to aim. I gave myself one glance to the left on the next open section and caught a shape that was both nothing and enough. A pale, thin something moving through the darker rocks with the efficiency of a person on a track they've run 100 times. No headlamp glow, no reflective fabric catch, no color. Just that paleness and a speed that my brain kept wanting to slow down so it could study it, and the paleness refused to cooperate. By the last set of switchbacks, we were comfortable in an uncomfortable way. The weather wasn't worse, and the lower we went, the more the sleet became wet snow and then slush. The trees thickened. The trail got familiar. Places I'd seen on the way up slotted back into my skull like good puzzle pieces. The low log we had stepped over. The erratic with a white quartz streak like a scar. The root system that forced the path into a little S-curve. We passed the spur sign and took the main trail back down toward Iron Creek. Evan said, "Almost there," because it's human to mark the nearing of an end out loud. I said nothing because I had a sense. This isn't mystical. It's the same sense you get in traffic when a driver to your left hasn't looked over yet and you know you should give them room, that we weren't done. We came out of the trees into the last stretch where the lot shows itself in glimpses between trunks. The air carried the cold metal smell of cars that have sat and cooled. That's when I noticed the game camera. It was strapped to a tree with a black nylon webbing and a rattled-looking ratchet, 4 feet off the ground, angled down the length of the lot like an eye watching everyone arrive. I would have missed it in summer when leaf cover makes the forest thick. In late September with the light low, it looked obvious. Even if you weren't looking for it, the little box poked at your peripheral vision. The camera's SD card door hung open, empty. It had that disemboweled look electronics get when the thing that makes them themselves is missing. Fresh prints led to it. The prints matched the set that cut our campsite. Long, even toes, narrow heel. Only now they were perfectly laid in the thin skin of slush on the hard-packed path. They came from the direction of the creek, stopped at the base of the camera tree where the bark was scuffed at hand height, and then turned and went back toward the water. We followed them with our eyes to the creek crossing. The last 3 lay on flat rocks like someone had stepped carefully to avoid the mud. Then they stopped. There was no track into the water. There was no track out. The surface of the creek toward the far side was unmarked, except for the disturbed standing eddies around larger stones. The slush on the near bank recorded the first 2 steps, and then went empty. The only way to read that tableau was to tell yourself a story, pick one, and live with it. At the car we moved like people in a rainstorm. Packs into the trunk. Poles collapsed and stowed. Boots swapped for dry shoes. Spray set in the cup holder for no reason other than to feel like we had a plan if someone opened our door. I started the engine and felt relief out of all proportion to what an engine can be expected to do for you. As it warmed the windshield and started to melt the slush that had collected at the wipers, I looked back toward the camera. The door hung open like a mouth. A little bead of water gathered on the edge of the empty slot, trembled, and fell. No one else was in the lot. No new cars had arrived. We didn't drive straight home. We stopped at the Stanley Ranger Station because leaving without telling anyone would have felt like stealing. The station was warm and smelled like old paper and fleece. A single person sat at the desk, mid-20s, seasonal uniform, hair tied up in a practical knot, a fatigue around the eyes that said September had been busy. We told her we wanted to file an observation, nothing dramatic, just something that might matter to whoever had set a camera at Iron Creek. She asked the right questions. Where, when, which tree, what it faced, what we saw. We described the SD door open and the fresh prints. When we got to the prints, she held up a hand politely like she was slowing us down to keep notes clear. Human barefoot? She said. Or, not human, I said. Bare, 5 toes, 2 long, even, narrow heel. The line was confident. I realized that last word wasn't helpful and stopped. Any claw marks? She asked. Dogs sometimes. No, I said, then corrected myself because I'm the kind of person who hates being too sure. Maybe, but not where you'd expect and not obvious. There was a clicking, like nails on rock. I could hear myself and I hated it. I sounded like a person trying not to sound like a person telling a story. Any breath? She asked, and then smiled a little, like that was absurd. Then let the smile go, because we weren't laughing with her. No, I said. That's the thing I keep getting stuck on. No breathing. Fast, hard running, no breathing. She wrote that down. She asked about the deer hair, and when we described it, she looked up sharply like she'd heard that before, and didn't like hearing it again. Between branches? She said. At about your height? She is shorter than me. Higher, I said. My eye line. I'm 6 feet. She wrote that down too. She thanked us and said she'd pass the camera note along. She said the Forest Service doesn't endorse private cameras on public land in a lot of situations, but that people still mount them, and sometimes someone steals the cards for reasons that are boring, like wanting elk photos, and sometimes for reasons that aren't. She asked if we wanted to leave our contact info. We did. She asked if we were hurt, if we'd had to use our spray, if we had any photos of the sign or the camera or the prints. and we shook our heads. We didn't take a single picture. I didn't even take a photo of the lake when we arrived, and I always do. She said that was okay. Not everything needs to be documented to be real. The way she said it made me think this wasn't the first time in September someone had sat in that office and said something about the sawtooths that didn't fit into a neat trail report. We drove out on Highway 21 with the heater on full, even though the day was brightening. The sleet had burned off. The sky had become that crisp fall blue that makes the mountains look like they were scrubbed. We didn't talk much for the first hour. My brain was busy doing its two simultaneous jobs. One part of me replaying the night and trying to explain it with normal tools, and another part filing small practical notes about the trip. A mental checklist of what we did right, what we could have done better. Then something simple broke the spell. We stopped at a turnout where a stream cut under the road, and I got out to clear a clump of slush off the wheel well that was making a dull thump. When I bent to break it off, I saw 3 coarse pale hairs on my cuff. They were caught in the rough fabric like they had been combed there. I pinched them free, and without thinking, I set them on the guardrail post. The wind took them, they lifted, and were gone. I don't know why I didn't keep them. I think I didn't want to bring anything home. I can't give you a dramatic conclusion because the facts don't give me one. We made it home. We unpacked. We slept like people who had spent a night thinking about not sleeping. I called the ranger station 2 days later and asked if anyone had come for the camera card. The person who answered didn't know, but took a message. A week after that, someone from the station called back and said only that they had passed along the information. Thank you for reporting. Please continue to report anything unusual. Please continue to hang your food correctly. Please remember that weather changes fast in the sawtooths. It was the kind of official answer that is exactly right and also not an answer at all. I didn't want to go back right away. That's not fear. That's the calculation you make after you get away clean. But I drove up again in October with my wife to see the last of the color and to show her where we'd camped. We kept to the lower trails. At Iron Creek, I looked for the camera out of habit and it was gone. The strap had left a scar on the bark and the bark was already starting to swell to cover it. There were no prints in the by then frozen ground. There were the prints of 100 boots. We walked as far as the first footbridge and watched the water pass under us with the speed you only appreciate when it's under your feet. I remembered the empty end of the prints on the rocks, and the way the creek took the story and broke it into unreadable pieces. We turned back before the climb because the wind picked up and cut without mercy. My wife asked me if it had looked like this when I came down with Evan. Exactly like this, I said, and then I realized I'd told myself that on purpose. Because admitting that it had been different in any way would be the same as admitting it could be like that again. There's a human way to close a story like this, and I've heard it so many times I can recite it. You say you learn to respect the mountains, that you believe in your gut more now, that you carry more gear, that you'll never camp alone again, and all of that is true. But here's the clean version without lessons. We went up to Alpine Lake in late September for a quiet night. After dark, something ran by our tent 3 times with the speed and commitment of a person in a race, and without any sound of breath. In the morning, a line of bare prints with long, even toes arced through our sight, like it had come to collect our trail and file it. There was deer hair pulled between 2 branches at my eye height, like someone had drawn it and left it for a reason that does not fit into any box I keep for normal things. We left in 10 minutes and never stopped moving. The runner paralleled us on the last switchbacks, keeping its distance, and vanishing when the trail bent. At the trailhead, a game camera faced the lot with its car door open and empty, and fresh prints led from it to the creek crossing where they ended on dry rock as if the water had taken them. That's the whole thing. We ate dinner at home that night like people who had been out in clean air. We slept. We woke up. We went to work on Monday. And every time since then that I lace boots and shoulder a pack and a piece of cold air gets in under my collar, and my breath fogs and the trees stand in straight lines and the rock breaks into clean blocks, I'm listening for that dry clicking on stone. I haven't heard it again. That's enough for me. I don't need it twice.